Berlin, April 30th, 1945. The Red Army is only a few streets away, and the air outside the Reich Chancellery smells of smoke and dust. Inside the Führer bunker, a small group of exhausted loyalists whisper that their leader is gone, but no one really knows what happened. From that day forward, the story of Adolf Hitler's death became a battlefield of its own, filled with forgeries, testimonies, and fantasies that have refused to die for 80 years. Fact 1. The Burning Room. The official death that no one saw. The official story says Adolf Hitler shot himself in his private quarters on April 30th, 1945, while his wife, Eva Braun, took poison beside him. His aides, Otto Günsche and Heinz Linge, claimed they entered moments later, wrapped the bodies in blankets, carried them into the garden of the Reich Chancellery, and burned them using jerry cans of gasoline. Soviet troops would arrive just hours later to find charred remains among the debris. Yet the problem began immediately. No one outside that bunker ever saw the bodies. The Soviets, who reached the site first, kept all discoveries secret. Stalin himself refused to confirm Hitler's death, telling Western leaders that the Nazi dictator had probably escaped. His statement fueled decades of speculation. Conspiracy theories flourished. Hitler had fled to Spain, to Argentina, even to Antarctica. Each story thrived on the same foundation: absence of proof. When Soviet officers finally examined what they believed to be Hitler's remains, they found fragments, a jawbone, a skull with a bullet hole, bits of dental work. The materials were sent to Moscow and locked away. The Allies, denied access, were left with second-hand Soviet reports. For decades, historians debated whether these fragments even belonged to Hitler. In 2009, DNA tests revealed that one skull fragment, long exhibited as proof of Hitler's suicide, actually belonged to a woman under 40. Still, the dental remains, compared to X-rays kept by Hitler's personal dentist, matched with striking precision. They remain the strongest forensic evidence confirming his death. But even that truth carries a strange emptiness. The absence of a full body, the secrecy of Soviet archives, and the deep need to believe that such evil could not simply end in a gray underground room, all of it combined to turn one man's death into an enduring myth. For the survivors of Berlin, that day didn't feel like closure. It felt like a curtain pulled too quickly, hiding something unfinished. Even as the Reich collapsed, Hitler's death refused to settle into history. It became something else, a ghost story at the heart of the 20th century. Fact 2. The Soviet Secret: how Stalin turned Hitler's death into a weapon. When Soviet forces entered Berlin, the Reich lay in ruins. Amid shattered concrete and bodies, they found the remains of the man who had destroyed half of Europe. Or at least that's what they thought. But Stalin, ever the manipulator, saw something more valuable than a corpse: a narrative weapon. Within days of Hitler's supposed suicide, the Soviet leader ordered his security services to keep all evidence under strict control and to release nothing to the Allies. The mystery itself, he decided, would serve him better than the truth. The Soviet counterintelligence unit, SMERSH, took charge of the investigation. They collected ashes, bone fragments, and the dental bridge believed to belong to Hitler. Witnesses from the bunker, guards, secretaries, and officers, were arrested and interrogated in secret prisons. Their testimonies were filtered, edited, and used selectively. In official Soviet reports, contradictions were common and deliberate. One day, Stalin's officials told the press that Hitler had shot himself. The next, they hinted he had escaped in disguise. In July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, Stalin told President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill that Hitler had fled. He claimed the Führer might be hiding in Spain or Argentina. Both Western leaders were startled, and the seed of doubt was planted. For Stalin, it was perfect psychological warfare. Let the West chase ghosts, question each other, and wonder whether the Nazi menace might still be alive somewhere beyond reach. Behind closed doors, Soviet pathologists did conduct examinations. They identified Hitler's dental remains based on the testimony of Käthe Häusermann, assistant to his dentist, Hugo Blaschke. Her detailed descriptions of gold bridges and unusual fillings matched exactly with what they had found. Still, Stalin ordered all conclusions classified. No announcement, no photos, no confirmation. The world was left in limbo. When the Cold War began, this uncertainty became a useful tool. Soviet propaganda used it to mock Western intelligence agencies, accusing them of hiding the living Hitler. Western newspapers, in turn, speculated about submarines to South America, plastic surgery, or secret Nazi colonies in Patagonia. Each rumor, no matter how absurd, gave new life to Stalin's lie. By the time the truth resurfaced decades later, the damage was done. Hitler's death was no longer just a historical event. It was a Cold War myth, shaped by Stalin's paranoia and the world's hunger for mystery. The Soviets had turned one man's suicide into an endless riddle, ensuring that the ghost of Adolf Hitler would continue to serve their narrative long after the guns of 1945 had gone silent. Fact 3. The missing body. Why no one ever found Hitler's corpse. When the gunshot echoed through the bunker, Hitler's final act lasted only a few seconds. But the confusion that followed would last for generations. His aides wrapped the bodies, carried them into the Chancellery garden, doused them in gasoline, and set them alight. Soviet artillery thundered above, as flames devoured what was left of the Third Reich. By evening, the corpses had turned to ash. Yet that act, meant to erase him, birthed the greatest mystery of all. There was never a complete body to bury. When the Soviets arrived 2 days later, they searched the site in near total darkness. Pits were filled with debris, bricks, and the remains of dozens of soldiers. What they found were only fragments: a jawbone with gold fillings, a piece of skull, and part of a bridge plate. But in the chaos of Berlin's collapse, even those finds were uncertain. Was the jaw truly Hitler's, or that of a decoy body burned nearby? Some witnesses claimed the corpses had been drenched in too little fuel. Others swore they'd seen the Führer's remains still recognizable before more fuel was poured and the bodies burned again. Every version conflicted. Heinz Linge said the body was unrecognizable within minutes. Otto Gunsche insisted it was reduced entirely to ashes. Other accounts from soldiers claimed to have seen pieces of scorched clothing and the unmistakable mustache. When these contradictions reached Soviet investigators, they made the story even murkier. In the post-war years, Western intelligence agencies searched for the body relentlessly. The FBI opened dozens of files on reported Hitler sightings in Colombia, in Argentina, in the mountains of Chile. None proved true, yet each new rumor fed public doubt. A corpse, after all, is evidence. Without one, imagination filled the void. The Soviets, meanwhile, kept the remains under extreme secrecy. In 1970, fearing that Hitler's burial site in East Germany might become a neo-Nazi shrine, the KGB ordered the remains, what little was left, to be destroyed completely. They were burned once more, crushed, and the ashes scattered into a river near Magdeburg. The final trace of the dictator vanished into muddy water. That decision sealed the legend. A dictator who had built his empire on spectacle and visibility disappeared into nothingness. No funeral, no grave, no monument, only rumors and ashes. For many, it felt too fitting, too convenient. How could the man responsible for such vast destruction simply dissolve into history without a trace? And so the myth took on its own life. The missing body became proof for believers, denial for followers, and fascination for everyone else. In death, as in life, Adolf Hitler commanded the world's attention, even when nothing of him remained to be seen. Fact 4. The escape. Myth, the Argentina legend that wouldn't die. It began with whispers in 1945 that a German submarine had slipped away from Europe, bound for the southern tip of the world. Argentina, they said, a land of wide plains, sympathetic regimes, and a long coastline perfect for disappearing. Within months, Allied intelligence was flooded with reports claiming Adolf Hitler had survived. He had shaved his mustache, changed his name, and was living in Patagonia under the protection of powerful friends. This was not idle gossip. The FBI and British intelligence both investigated it. Declassified files show hundreds of reports. A farmer in Córdoba who swore he saw a small man with Hitler's voice. A waiter in Buenos Aires who claimed to have served a quiet German couple with thick accents. And even fishermen who said a submarine had surfaced off the Argentine coast in July 1945. The fact that real German U-boats, U-530 and U-977, surrendered there that same year only deepened suspicion. Why had they traveled so far after Germany's surrender? What or who were they carrying? Argentina itself, under President Juan Perón, had quietly welcomed thousands of former Nazis through secret routes known as the Rat Lines, organized escape networks that passed through Spain and Italy. Men like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele did, in fact, reach South America and live there for years. So when people claimed Hitler had done the same, the story sounded less absurd than it should have. Books, documentaries, and tabloid headlines fanned the fire. The story changed with every retelling. Hitler lived in a villa in Bariloche. He escaped in a convoy of U-boats. He raised children under an assumed name. In one version, Eva Braun survived too, their children speaking German with an Argentine accent. In another, the Führer became a recluse in the mountains, cared for by loyal SS officers. None of it was supported by evidence, but it gave millions something strange to believe in, that evil could not have ended so simply. When Western intelligence agencies re-examined the Soviet dental evidence in the 1960s, it should have closed the case. It didn't. The myth had already outgrown the truth. Every absence, the missing body, the Soviet secrecy, the cold silence of the witnesses, became fuel for those who wanted to believe the war's darkest figure was still out there. Even decades later, with modern DNA testing confirming the remains as Hitler's, documentaries still return to Patagonia. They show grainy photographs of old men in mountain villages, faces blurred by time. None are him. But the myth persists because it offers something that history rarely gives: an escape from justice, a mystery without an end. In a world still haunted by the memory of his crimes, the idea that Hitler might have lived on became a perverse comfort to some and a profitable fantasy to others. The truth was ashes. The lie, that he escaped, proved far harder to burn. Fact 5. The Doppelganger. The search for Hitler's second body. In the ruins of Berlin, amid smoke, rubble, and confusion, Soviet soldiers found something unexpected. A second body that looked eerily like Adolf Hitler. It lay near the entrance to the Reich Chancellery Garden, dressed in the same uniform, with a similar mustache and haircut. The discovery stunned the troops. For days, reports circulated that the Führer's corpse had been found, and then found again. But whose body was it? The Soviets quickly realized that they had stumbled upon one of the greatest confusions of the post-war world. A decoy. A double. In the final weeks of the Third Reich, at least one of Hitler's personal doubles is believed to have remained in Berlin. Eyewitnesses from the bunker recalled men who resembled him, trained to stand in during public appearances or to protect his movements. Some of these claims were exaggerated by post-war mythmakers, but others came from credible sources within the SS. The body that Soviet soldiers recovered showed key inconsistencies. The mustache was slightly shorter, the wounds didn't match, and the dental structure was wrong. Even so, the Soviets kept it under examination for weeks, unsure which corpse was the real one. Stalin's secret police interrogated captured witnesses again and again, forcing them to identify the remains. Some were told they were wrong and punished for it. Others simply broke down, unable to say. The confusion worked perfectly for Soviet propaganda. If the enemy couldn't be sure which corpse was real, maybe none of them were. Western intelligence agencies soon learned of this second Hitler. American and British reports noted multiple remains believed to be Hitler, fueling endless rumors of body doubles, surgical impersonations, and last-minute substitutions. The notion that Hitler might have sent a look-alike to die in his place became one of the most enduring wartime legends. Over time, several individuals were named as the supposed double: Gustav Wehler, a cook; Heinrich Berger, an SS orderly, even an unknown soldier found near the bunker. None of these identifications could be confirmed. What mattered was not who they were, but what they symbolized. The fog of a regime built on deception. The myth of the doppelganger echoed the Nazi obsession with illusion: staged photographs, rehearsed rallies, actors made to play soldiers for propaganda films. In death, that culture of lies swallowed its own creator. The truth of who lay in that garden became as twisted as the ideology that led them there. When historians later examined the surviving Soviet dental fragments, they confirmed the real Hitler had indeed died in the bunker. But by then, it didn't matter. The public had already accepted a darker, more cinematic ending, one where the Führer slipped away, leaving a double to burn in his place. In the rubble of Berlin, one body was enough to end a war, yet the other, the false one, ensured that the war's most haunting story would never end at all. Fact 6. The dentist's truth: how Hitler was identified by his teeth. When every trace of Hitler's body had been burned, bombed, or scattered, one small fragment survived: his teeth. In a war that erased millions, those few bones became the only evidence that the architect of destruction was truly gone. What remained of his corpse was so mangled that only a handful of charred dental, bridges, and gold crowns could still speak for him. And yet those teeth would become the single most convincing proof of Hitler's death, a truth locked away for decades behind the Iron Curtain. In May 1945, Soviet investigators from the counterintelligence agency SMERSH arrived at the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. Among the debris, they found a small box of dental remains wrapped in cloth. The fragments were delivered to Moscow along with two prisoners, Käthe Häusermann, Hitler's dental assistant, and Fritz Echtmann, the laboratory technician who had made his prosthetics. Both were interrogated for days. They were shown the jawbone and asked to identify it. Häusermann recognized it instantly: the unique gold bridge, the position of a porcelain crown, the wire frame connecting the molars. She broke down crying. It was, she said, without any doubt, Adolf Hitler. Soviet examiners compared her testimony with X-rays recovered from Hitler's medical files, captured by Allied forces. The match was perfect. The bridgework, the missing teeth, even a peculiar left molar fracture aligned precisely with the Führer's dental chart. No two mouths in the world could have duplicated it. The conclusion was clear: Hitler was dead. But Stalin refused to announce it. He feared that confirming the dictator's death might turn him into a martyr, or worse, deprive the Soviet Union of a valuable psychological advantage. So the evidence remained classified, sealed inside secret archives for nearly half a century. For decades, Western governments were forced to rely on rumors and conjecture. Only in 1968 did fragments of the Soviet investigation become public, and even then, the files were incomplete. When researchers finally re-examined the teeth in the 1990s and again in 2017, the verdict remained unchanged. The dental bridge and jawbone belonged to Adolf Hitler. The materials, craftsmanship, and alignment matched his wartime X-rays beyond dispute. It was an almost absurd conclusion: that the man who built an empire of death and sought immortality through ideology was ultimately undone by something as small as a dental plate. The evidence that ended 1,000 conspiracy theories wasn't found in his words or his legacy, but in the fragile bones of his mouth, proof that even the greatest monsters are made of nothing more enduring than flesh, bone, and decay. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, the jaw was quietly shown to Western historians under strict supervision. Behind bulletproof glass, those few broken teeth rested, mute witnesses to the end of a myth. In the end, it was not a confession, not a document, and not a photograph that proved Hitler's death. It was the mouth that had once shouted across crowds, now silent, reduced to fragments that spoke the only truth left. He did not escape. He burned, and he was gone. Fact 7. The skulls that lied: how the wrong bones reignited the legend. For decades, Soviet officials displayed what they claimed was Hitler's skull, a fractured bone with a bullet hole, preserved in a locked drawer deep inside Moscow's state archives. It was shown only to a handful of Western visitors. A piece of cranium, yellowed with age, resting beside a rusted pistol and a section of sofa fabric supposedly stained with the Führer's blood. For the world, it was grisly proof that Hitler had died exactly as the Soviets said. A bullet to the head, followed by flames. But one test, half a century later, would turn that certainty into chaos once again. In 2009, a team of American researchers was allowed to examine the skull fragment under supervision. They performed a simple DNA test, the kind used in every police lab today. The result was shocking. The bone didn't belong to a man at all. It came from a woman, probably under the age of 40. The sample that had been exhibited as Adolf Hitler's skull for more than 60 years was someone else's remains entirely. The revelation hit like a bomb. Newspapers around the world proclaimed Hitler's skull was a fake. Television shows revived the old conspiracy, that Hitler might have escaped, that the Soviets had fabricated the story, that everything we believed about his final moments had been a lie. Once again, a war that had ended in 1945 was dragged back into doubt. Historians tried to calm the storm. The jawbone and dental bridges, long confirmed as authentic, were still the definitive proof. The skull fragment, they explained, had likely been misidentified in the early chaos of post-war Berlin. Soviet investigators had collected remains from multiple burial sites around the Chancellery Garden. Soldiers, civilians, even animals. In the rush to find evidence of the Führer, someone had mislabeled one of the fragments. Stalin's paranoia ensured it would never be rechecked. Still, the damage was done. A single laboratory error, multiplied by decades of secrecy, revived one of history's most poisonous myths. Conspiracy theorists pointed to the woman's skull as proof that the Soviets had lied all along, while others suggested it belonged to Eva Braun or an unknown bunker victim. The real answer was simpler: bureaucratic chaos, human error, and political fear. But that, perhaps, was the final irony. The man who built his empire on deception, who thrived on confusion and spectacle, left behind a death just as confusing, just as theatrical. His own end became a riddle because the victors, too, wanted a story that served them. The burned bodies, the secret autopsies, the mislabeled skull, all fragments of a truth buried under propaganda. In the end, the skull that lied was more than a mistake. It was a symbol. It showed how even a regime's collapse could be twisted into myth. A single bone had kept Hitler alive in rumor for another generation, proving once again that history's deadliest ghosts are not buried in the ground. They live in the stories we fail to verify. Fact 8. The bunker witnesses, the last circle who watched the end. Deep beneath the burning streets of Berlin, in that narrow warren of concrete and fear known as the Führer bunker, Hitler's final circle waited for history to collapse around them. It was April 1945, and outside, the Soviet artillery was pounding the city to rubble. Inside, the air smelled of damp concrete, gasoline, and despair. Those who remained, secretaries, aides, and guards, were witnesses to the final unraveling of the Nazi dream. And yet, after the war, their testimonies would become both the most vital and the most contested evidence of how Hitler died. Among them were Traudl Junge, his young secretary, Otto Günsche, his adjutant, Heinz Linge, his valet, and Eva Braun, the woman who refused to leave him. Over the last week of April, these people lived in total darkness, surviving on canned food and coffee substitutes while listening to the city above them die. Hitler, pale and trembling, still dictated orders to phantom divisions that no longer existed. He blamed his generals, cursed the German people, and then, on April 29th, married Eva Braun in a small ceremony. The witnesses signed the document in silence, knowing it was meaningless. The next day, he gave his final instructions. His body was to be burned so that it could not be displayed like Mussolini's. He shook hands with his staff, thanked them, and withdrew into his room with Eva. Around 3:30 p.m., a gunshot echoed through the bunker. When Linge and Gunsche entered, they found what remained. Hitler slumped on the sofa, a pistol in his hand, Eva motionless beside him. They wrapped the bodies, carried them through the corridors, and set them ablaze in the garden. After the surrender, these same witnesses were captured by the Soviets. They were interrogated for months, sometimes brutally, their statements rewritten to fit Moscow's shifting narrative. Still, their accounts, despite small contradictions, were remarkably consistent. They all described the same sequence of events, the same rituals, the same final silence before the shot. In 1947, when Western intelligence finally gained access to some of these testimonies, they were surprised by how unremarkable Hitler's death sounded. No grand speech, no last words of defiance. Just a man collapsed under the weight of his own delusions. But that quiet truth didn't satisfy the world's imagination. The absence of witnesses outside the bunker made people suspect a cover-up. Every tiny inconsistency, the timing of the gunshot, the placement of the body, the smell of gasoline, became fuel for speculation. For the survivors, however, there was no mystery left. Traudl Junge later said that when she heard the gunshot, she felt no shock, only a strange sense of relief. It was over, she recalled. The spell was broken. Those who lived through that hour were not the architects of history, only its reluctant witnesses. And yet, their words became the fragile thread holding the truth together. A truth drowned in rumor, but still whispered from that dark bunker. That in the final moment, the man who once commanded armies faced only silence, smoke, and the echo of his own defeat. Fact 9. The Berlin Ghosts: How Rumors of Survival Spread Through the Ruins. In the summer of 1945, Berlin was a city without sound. The guns had gone silent, but the ruins still whispered. Amid the rubble, among burned-out tanks and shattered apartments, rumors began to move. Quiet at first, then louder. People said Hitler wasn't dead. He had escaped in a plane at dawn. He was hiding in the U-boat pens on the Baltic coast. He had shaved his mustache and walked among refugees heading west. In a city where every fact had turned to dust, the myth of his survival felt almost like hope. Dark, irrational hope that chaos still had a master. The Allies unintentionally fed the legend. Their own intelligence files were full of contradictions. Stalin claimed Hitler was alive in Spain. The British said he had died in the bunker. American papers printed both versions on the same day. For ordinary Germans, this confusion sounded like conspiracy. Many could not imagine that the man who dominated every aspect of their lives, whose voice thundered from every radio, whose portrait hung in every office, had simply vanished. Death seemed too small an ending. In the months after the surrender, Allied patrols across Europe reported strange sightings. In Denmark, a fisherman swore he'd ferried a German officer with Hitler's eyes. In Italy, a priest claimed a wounded soldier confessed to guarding him in a monastery. Even in Egypt, British diplomats received tips that a prominent German politician had crossed the Mediterranean on a merchant ship. None of these reports were true, but each carried the same tremor of fear, that Nazism had not died with its leader. American intelligence took these rumors seriously. The newly formed FBI opened a file titled Hitler: Escape and Survival Theories, which would eventually grow to over 700 pages. Agents in Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay were ordered to follow every lead, no matter how absurd. Declassified documents reveal how resources were wasted chasing shadows: old men with mustaches, exiled Germans, or drifters mistaken for fugitives. The real cause of this obsession was psychological. After years of propaganda portraying Hitler as more than human, a genius, a savior, a demigod, it was difficult for both followers and enemies to accept his ordinariness in death. A burned corpse in a ditch didn't match the scale of his crimes or his myth. People wanted a more cinematic ending: an escape, a secret base, a hidden empire waiting to rise again. In the first post-war years, graffiti appeared on Berlin's walls. Lebt. He lives. Children whispered it to each other on the streets. Former party members clung to it as comfort. Even Allied soldiers, uneasy in the destroyed capital, wondered whether the dictator's shadow still lingered. Decades later, historians would call it a collective refusal. The need to believe the nightmare had not simply ended with a gunshot. But in that broken city, surrounded by ruins and ghosts, it made sense. After all, the war had erased so many people without a trace. Why not him too? So the legend walked through Berlin that summer, invisible, untouchable, half-believed. Hitler was gone, but his absence felt so vast that people mistook it for presence. The truth had burned away in the garden of the Chancellery. What survived was myth, smoke, and the uneasy feeling that evil rarely dies as quietly as it should. Fact 10. The Western Hunt. Why the Allies spent years chasing a dead man. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the war in Europe was over, but for Allied intelligence, another battle had just begun. The search for Adolf Hitler. Officially, the Führer was dead. Unofficially, nobody could prove it. No photographs, no corpse, no witnesses beyond a handful of shaken Germans who had served him in his final hours. For Washington and London, that was not enough. They needed certainty. And so began one of the strangest investigations in modern history. A manhunt for a man who no longer existed. Within weeks of Berlin's fall, the British intelligence agency MI6 and the newly formed American Office of Strategic Services launched independent inquiries. Dozens of officers were sent across Europe, South America, and even North Africa to track rumors of Hitler's escape. They collected statements from captured Nazi officials, scoured hospitals, and questioned priests, smugglers, and ship captains. Every whisper mattered. A half-burned passport in Austria, a shadowy German seen in Patagonia, a submarine reported off the coast of Chile. Each fragment became part of a sprawling map of paranoia. By 1946, the Allies were operating under two conflicting pressures: public anxiety and political distrust. The Soviets refused to release any evidence they had recovered. Stalin hinted that the Western powers themselves might be hiding Hitler. In return, the Americans accused Moscow of fabricating evidence to cover up his escape. It was a Cold War before the Cold War, fought not with bombs, but with speculation. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, even maintained an open Hitler file for nearly 20 years. Each decade brought new sightings: Hitler as a hermit in Paraguay, Hitler as a merchant in Colombia, Hitler as an aging patient in a Buenos Aires hospital. Agents dutifully logged every report, even when they came from drunken sailors or self-proclaimed psychic mediums. Hoover, ever cautious, ordered his staff to verify but not dismiss. The result was absurd: bureaucratic myth-making disguised as investigation. British intelligence faced the same madness. In 1947, MI6 analysts reviewed hundreds of witness statements and quietly concluded that Hitler had, in fact, died in the bunker. Their internal report noted, "All credible evidence supports suicide by firearm." But they didn't publish it. Politically, the uncertainty served its own purpose. It kept Nazi fugitives nervous, made Soviet claims look unreliable, and gave Western governments leverage in propaganda wars. For years, the ghost of Hitler floated through classified files. He became a symbol of unfinished justice, a name whispered in briefing rooms and barbed wire camps. Even when solid evidence emerged, the dental identification, the bunker testimonies, the autopsy fragments, agencies hesitated to declare the case closed. Perhaps they feared the myth more than the truth. It wasn't until 1968, with the release of the first Soviet investigation, that most historians finally agreed. Hitler had died in Berlin, exactly as his aides had described. But by then, the damage was done. The world had spent 2 decades chasing a corpse. The irony was brutal. The dictator who had ruled through illusion left behind one final illusion that even his enemies couldn't resist. The Allies, in their need for absolute proof, gave his myth the oxygen it needed to survive. They turned the ashes of a bunker suicide into a global legend. Proof that even when evil is destroyed, disbelief can keep it alive. Fact 11. The Soviet autopsy: how politics rewrote the body of a dictator. In May 1945, in the shattered garden of the Reich Chancellery, Soviet officers from Smersh exhumed what they believed were the remains of Adolf Hitler. The body was burned, twisted, half buried in debris. Yet from that unrecognizable mass, Moscow demanded certainty. Stalin wanted proof, not for truth's sake, but for control. What followed was not science. It was theater disguised as forensic work, an autopsy carried out under the shadow of ideology. The examination took place at a field hospital in Buch, a suburb of Berlin. A team of Soviet pathologists, led by Major Faust Shkarovsky, worked on the bodies of several bunker victims. Among them were the charred remains labeled as Hitler, Braun, and Goebbels. The doctors had little to work with: ash, bone, and melted flesh. Still, under pressure, they produced a report. The findings claimed that Hitler had died by cyanide poisoning, not a gunshot. They described blue lips, traces of prussic acid in the tissues, and even noted that the skull showed no exit wound. The problem? None of it matched eyewitness accounts from inside the bunker. Every German survivor, Gunsche, Linge, Junge, had described a gunshot to the temple. Yet Stalin's government needed a different story. A suicide by poison made for a more humiliating image, the once mighty Führer reduced to a coward, dying quietly instead of defiantly. The autopsy was rewritten to serve propaganda. Soviet newspapers soon printed selective details from the report. They described Hitler's body in lurid, mocking terms: short, deformed, degenerate. The intent was clear: to erase his aura, to strip him of any remaining grandeur. In the following months, the original autopsy files vanished into secret archives. When Western historians later requested access, they were told the records had been lost. In reality, they were locked away by the NKVD, guarded as state secrets until the 1960s. When fragments of the report finally surfaced decades later, they revealed how political manipulation had warped the evidence. The chemical tests were inconclusive, the descriptions inconsistent, the timeline confused. Some details bordered on absurd. The report even noted that Hitler had only one testicle, a claim repeated endlessly in Western media. Yet no credible anatomical proof supported it. It was a detail born of Soviet mockery, not medicine. The Soviet autopsy became one more layer of distortion, proof that even in death, Hitler's body was used as a weapon, this time of narrative control. By mixing truth with invention, Stalin ensured that the real story of Hitler's death would remain uncertain, buried under contradictions. In the end, historians pieced together the truth from other sources: the eyewitnesses, the dental remains, the German records. But the autopsy's legacy remained, a reminder that history written in the service of power is as fragile as the bodies it claims to describe. And so, in that Buch hospital, surrounded by rubble and ideology, the last physical trace of the Third Reich became something else entirely. Not a corpse, but a message. A dictator's body dissected not for understanding, but for revenge. Fact 12. The last lie: how Hitler's death became his final act of control. By the end of April 1945, Adolf Hitler had lost everything. His army shattered, his capital in ruins, his dream of empire burned to ash. Yet even as the walls trembled and the Soviets closed in, he still had one last weapon: control over the story. To the very end, Hitler dictated not only his will, but the narrative of his own death. Every instruction was deliberate. His body must be burned. His ashes must never be found. The world must never see him humiliated as Mussolini had been. It was not the act of a madman, but of a man obsessed with legacy. In his mind, physical death was tolerable. Ridicule was not. The bonfire in the Chancellery garden was meant to erase him cleanly from the stage of history, to leave behind only myth, not spectacle. He imagined that by destroying his body, he could remain untouchable, a ghost too great to be captured, too mysterious to be fully condemned. The irony is that this very decision gave him the immortality he feared and desired. By burning himself into nothing, Hitler ensured the birth of endless speculation. His enemies doubted. His followers fantasized. The Soviets lied, the West searched, and the public wondered. A single match in that bunker created a fire that still burns in the imagination of millions. Over the decades, his death has been rewritten in every possible way. Escape stories, doubles, secret flights, hidden children. But beneath all the distortions lies a simple, brutal truth. He died exactly as he lived, manipulating belief. Even in his last hour, he dictated perception. He denied the world the closure it needed, and by doing so, he won the final battle, not in reality, but in rumor. In the end, there was no grand escape, no submarine to Argentina, no rebirth of the Reich in the shadows. There was only a trembling man, a pistol, and silence. The empire of lies collapsed in the same moment that its creator pulled the trigger. And yet, in that silence, he achieved what he could not in life: eternal ambiguity. 80 years later, Hitler's death remains a mirror. In it, we see not only the fall of a dictator, but the power of myth itself. How easily fear, secrecy, and doubt can outlive the facts. The body burned away long ago, but the story still smolders, whispering through time that even the truth, when hidden too long, can start to sound like legend.